Now, I'm not sure if I've said it before on this channel, but Batman is by far and away my favorite superhero. And whenever I was growing up, this wasn't an outlandish statement. Back then, the best superhero movie was The Dark Knight, and while there were still a ton of these movies to pick and choose from, it wasn't like it is today, where it seems like the only thing that could stop the biannual release of Marvel movies is a literal global pandemic. Plus, with the animated series, Justice League, Batman Beyond, and even the Arkham games, Batman was as popular as ever. And while he hasn't gotten much good representation in movies as of late, I still find Batman as a character inherently more intriguing than those portrayed in the MCU. But thankfully, with movies like Joker being released, the mainstream media is starting to realize one of the many great aspects of this character: his villains. The best heroes are always defined and contrasted by their villains. Specifically, Batman and Spider-Man come to mind. But where these two differ is Spider-Man's villains, while still great, don't really work that well on their own. But Batman's villains, his villains are a different story entirely. Batman's villains can not only be placed in a story by themselves, but when they share scenes with him, they can often outshine him. Obviously, this statement reigns mostly true with the Joker. Joker is the prototypical villain in the same way as Superman is for superheroes. When you think of a superhero villain, Joker is probably what comes to mind, and that's mostly because of his representation in media throughout the years. Cesar Romero, Jack Nicholson, Mark Hamill, Heath Ledger, and of course Joaquin Phoenix, who received an Oscar for his role as the character. This is some serious talent playing a comic book villain, even more so than the ones playing Batman. While each one of these actors portrays the character in their own way, no single one is the definitive portrayal of the character. Some love Joaquin's Joker. Some will never see anyone besides Heath Ledger as the Joker. Some psychopaths even like Jared Leto. But for me personally, Mark Hamill will always be the definitive voice of the Joker. And none of these are more right than others. Well, maybe except for Jared Leto. That's wrong in more ways than I can count. The character of Joker is a blank slate. His only real motivation is contrast Batman. When the Joker robs a bank, it isn't because he needs money, it's because he wants to get Batman's attention. Joker's end goal is to prove that he and Batman are practically the same. At one point in their life, they both had one bad day, and that one bad day killed them. Bruce Wayne died in the alley, and whoever Joker was before died in that vat of chemicals. But Batman is still pretending to be something he's not, pretending to be someone he's not. Bruce Wayne doesn't dress up at night and become Batman, he's always Batman. But when he's in board meetings, charity banquets, and fancy dinners, this is when he's pretending. Bruce Wayne doesn't dress up as Batman, Batman dresses up as Bruce Wayne. This is something that I think most don't understand. Christian Bale started this trend of doing a Batman voice, but there is no Batman voice. Yes, Batman does disguise his voice, but he changes it when he's Bruce Wayne. The one who understands this the most is Kevin Conroy, the voice actor for this character in most media that isn't live action, such as the animated series and the Arkham games. He doesn't do a Batman voice, he does a Bruce Wayne voice.
A call for Master Bruce from a Dr. March.
Hey, what's up, Doc? I'll return the favor next time you're raising funds. Bye-bye.
This computer checked that fiber against every animal species known to man.
But Joker doesn't do this. He doesn't pretend to be someone he's not. Batman and Joker have always seemed like forces of nature to me instead of human beings. Batman represents justice and righteousness, while Joker represents chaos. Whenever Batman takes on the Joker, he doesn't see a man. He sees everything that's wrong with Gotham. He sees his motivation for doing everything that he does. He sees a man in a dark alleyway with a loaded gun. But that's the Joker. What about when Batman is faced with a different villain? A villain that is not a force of nature, but instead someone who is all too human. A villain who is weak, who is afraid. Someone who overcomes these characteristics to devote his life, freedom, and health to another person. Someone like Mr. Freeze.
To never again walk on a summer's day with a hot wind in your face and a warm hand to hold. I'd kill for that.
Oddly enough, this is actually my second video having to do with this character, but that video was more about a fight in Arkham City. This video is an analysis about this character's motivation and how he relates back to Batman. And there's no better example for that topic than the episode of the animated series, Heart of Ice. The animated series was a big part of my childhood. Growing up, I had a couple of DVDs that I just watched over and over again. The main ones that I can remember being a VHS with the first couple of Justice League episodes on it, Stuart Little, which is actually one of M. Night Shyamalan's better movies, and Batman Mask of the Phantasm. While all of these are special to me in their own way, specifically, Mask of the Phantasm stood out to me. This movie is spectacular and could have a video on its own dedicated to it, but the point is, this film eventually led me back to the animated series. Every time I got a chance to watch it, I would. And there's no shortage of genuinely amazing episodes. I Am the Night, Robin's Reckoning, and Mad Love, just to name a few. But there was always one that stuck out to me. I'm not sure if it's because it scared me or because I recognized even back then how fantastic it was. And that episode, obviously, is Heart of Ice. Mr. Freeze as a character, he's one of Batman's more sympathetic villains, but that wasn't always the case. Back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Mr. Freeze was more or less a one-dimensional villain. He was basically a serial killer that used cold-related weapons to commit his crimes. So honestly, not that far off from what we got in Batman and Robin. But all that would eventually change, and a big part of that was this episode. The animated series is famous for changing details about existing characters or even creating brand new ones, and because of the popularity, these characters and additions would eventually roll over into the comics. The big ones that come to mind are the character of Harley Quinn, and yes, Mr. Freeze and his change in this episode. The episode starts off with Mr. Freeze talking to a kind of music box.
The monster who took you from me will soon learn that revenge is a dish best served cold.
Not only does this provide a pretty good ice-related pun, which is a requirement for this character as far as I'm concerned, but it also gives us a good introduction to this character for those who are unfamiliar. Next, we see Mr. Freeze attacking a certain corporation in Gotham. Given his monologue in the previous scene, we can deduce that this monster he was talking about would have something to do with this company, but Batman intervenes.
Freeze!
That's Mr. Freeze to you.
Honestly, pretty good. I'm liking the pun so far. Mr. Freeze overpowers Batman pretty easily and even freezes him solid. But during their fight, Mr. Freeze accidentally hits one of his men's legs, which is when we get this.
Take it easy, man. I got you.
Leave him. He should have been more careful. Now he's paid the price for his incompetence, and perhaps you'd like to share his fate.
Don't leave me, please!
This scene is a great representation of what Mr. Freeze wants you to think. He wants to appear cold, ruthless, uncaring, inhuman. His pale blue skin, Terminator-like red eyes, robotic suit, and altered monotone voice amplify this even more so. He leaves his man behind, even blaming him for getting in the way. The way he whimpers and begs for them to take him back with them really terrified me as a kid. Sure, the Joker killed people, but it was never so ruthless. This is much of the same things that Batman does. Batman dresses up as a bat because it was the one thing that scared him most as a child. He didn't just pick an animal to theme his superhero identity around. In fact, we see at one point that he tried to just dress up like a ninja and fight crime, but it wasn't working. They didn't fear him. His eyes are covered with white contacts. He moves silently, watches you from the rooftops, and strikes when you least expect it. Batman had to give something the criminals of Gotham to fear. He had to become, in a way, a monster. There's only one problem with this: Batman's humanity. When he escapes from the ice, instead of going after Mr. Freeze and possibly catching him, he stops to help this man. This man that didn't deserve it. This man that would not have done the same for him. But he does it anyway. Because under all of this, Batman is human. Skipping forward a bit, Batman has now broken into the company that Mr. Freeze has been attacking, and he finds the tapes of the incident that turned Mr. Freeze into the monster that he'd become.
Stop! This is my experiment. You can't stop it now. My wife is in there.
So bring her out.
You can't interrupt the process now. No! Stay away from her. Murderer! Oh! Oh!
Get out! Get out!
Nora! Nora!
My God.
Here we see Mr. Freeze humanized in a way that we haven't before. Instead of being this hulking, robotic monster, he's a scientist. But more importantly than that, he's scared. Mr. Freeze faced down Batman without batting an eye. He didn't flinch where most would cower in fear. But when faced with the possible death of his wife, we see him truly afraid. I'd compare Mr. Freeze in this episode to Frankenstein's monster. When looking between Victor Frankenstein and his monster, most would assume that this is the monster, this is the villain. But as anyone familiar with the story will tell you, Dr. Frankenstein is the real monster. Much in the same way, looking between Mr. Freeze and the CEO of GothCorp, Frank Boyle, it would be a stretch to say that Mr. Freeze is the monster of the story, because that's the obvious answer. But given what we just seen, it's evident that this isn't true at all. Boyle is the real monster here, willing to kill Victor's wife just to save money. The creators of the show knew this as well, which is why they had Mark Hamill voice Boyle in this episode, the voice of the Joker, practically the embodiment of evil in the entirety of the show. Batman and Mr. Freeze fight, and of course Batman wins. It's his show after all. He hands over the evidence to convict Boyle, and Freeze is locked up in the coldest cell in Arkham. And here we get to the last and most powerful scene in this entire episode, and the main reason I wanted to make this video in the first place.
I failed you. I wish there were another way for me to say it. I can only beg your forgiveness and pray you hear me somehow. Some place where a warm hand waits for mine.
This scene shows a much different Mr. Freeze. His suit is gone, his eyes are revealed, he looks human. He doesn't curse Batman, he doesn't vow to get vengeance. Instead, he sits solemnly in his cell and cries, apologizing to his wife for failing her. Mr. Freeze was not born an evil man. He was not born a monster, but instead he was made this way by the actions of one cruel man because of one bad day. Mr. Freeze is the mirror image of Batman, a crooked and corrupted image, sure, but still, they're the same. One bad day, one evil man created them. When Batman sees the Joker, he sees a man with a loaded gun in a dark alleyway. When Batman sees Mr. Freeze, he sees a little boy in a dark alleyway, broken, alone, and most of all, cold.